refuge spaces. The first one is pretty tiny, calling it the closet, essentially. So a closet is a small dead end, which provides great protection from enemy perception, flanking, and gunfire. There's just not enough space for anything, but it has a very high risk of being cornered, of an enemy finding you, and you don't really have a lot of choice here. So because of that, it's very important that the player reads it as a dead end. So if they're sort of running looking for a place to hide, they can see that this is a dead end and don't expect it to have more depth and opportunities than it actually provides. So shape-wise, this means that it needs to be a pretty shallow depth, apparent from the doorway, and use props and shapes that are crowded together and can contextually reinforce the idea of a dead-end concept. Basically concepts. So things like bathrooms. If you can see that there's a toilet in there, you don't expect there to be a rear entry to that bathroom. Or janitorial closets. They're great for that because players intuitively understand that they're going to be small with the single sort of entrance exit. Let's see. Sometimes these are great for putting some scavenging, that sort of thing, but essentially it's a high-risk hiding place. Moving on to an alcove. So an alcove is a semi-protected area of reduced risk. You've got these sort of backboards here, but they don't all protect you at once. You've got enough space here to be protected, but it's not big enough to really allow for a lot of maneuverability and loops. You have some loops here, but not quite a lot. This is not some place that you really want to fight from as much, but a lot of times using this sort of in cooperation with nearby other refuge spaces can be pretty helpful. This is the fort. So a fort is a compromised shelter with a pretty clear defined sort of outer boundary and able to essentially be surrounded on all sides. It provides sort of an opportunity to sort of break line of sight from and evade enemy perception. So you can run into a fort and break line of sight and then maybe run out the back entrance. So, but because of its size and because of limited control you have over entries, it makes fighting any more than a few enemies a pretty poor place to take a stand. So generally, characteristics of a fort tend to lack backboards. Here we actually have one right here, but you could see a variation where these have windows as well. Lots of entrances and exits, can be surrounded. Lots of loops, both moving outside and then back into the space. So you sort of you're using the boundaries of the space a lot. And dominant strategy tends to be that you get chased into a fort. You wait till the enemy sort of is jumping in, and then you jump out the other side. Or you use it to sort of circle back on the enemy and come around to attack them. So let's see. Moving forward to the next space. Calling this a hideout space. So the player retreats here in Crisis. This is a nice refuge, but this space it lacks a comprehensive sort of set of combat opportunities. You can't really defend this position well. It's wide, but it's not very deep. It's pretty shallow. As enemies are entering, the player sort of is forced to flee. And we maintain player pressure by avoiding any sort of like rear exits to the space. So if we had rear exits, it'd be more like the cabin or the fort sort of space. But here it's sort of like, as you can see, all the entrances and exits are sort of on one side. Okay, there is one right here, but this is still in view of the enemies that are out here. So this sort of allows the player to come in here, but then they need to escape again. But just to give the player a little bit of advantage, each of these major egresses right here are sort of slightly hidden from one another. So as you can see, if the enemy is at this spot right here, they can't necessarily see you if you've just gone out this right here. So, like I said, not very deep. The width generally is a lot wider than it is deep. And sort of the lack of depth is sort of in the alignment with the general sort of front direction. All right, and then finally, what I call a stronghold. So essentially a stronghold is an advantageous dead end. So this is a combat cell with enough opportunities to allow the player to sort of commit to the space and stand their ground. This is where the player wants to be in order to counter enemies, so that they can draw the player in here. There's a lot of ways that they sort of can maneuver around the space. They can flake the enemy. It's sort of like home turf for the player. Eventually, if there are enough enemies, with enough pressure, the player may need to retreat out of this space, but the options for retreat should be fairly exposed to threats. So to maintain tension, much like we do for the fortress, or say the hideout sort of space, we avoid having any rear exits, because any sort of rear exits releases the sense of tension. The player, in order to get out of this space, must sort of push their way through the force of antagonism, through the front entrance. We could have something, maybe an exit over here, but that it also is sort of exposed to the sort of enemies from the front. So the player should have to sort of earn escape if they've made their way into here. So characteristics, typically we have at least 2, usually 3 backboards. They're far enough away from each other so that you can't use all 3 of them at once. Depth and width is generally about equal, as opposed to like the hideout, which was a lot wider than it is deep. Here we have a lot of depth because we want to draw the player in and have them sort of draw the enemy in and get trapped. Exits are just on one side. So anyway, essentially this space is where we want to sort of draw the player in and force them to deal with the enemy. So if you look again at this map of Hunter Underpass, you can see where a lot of these spaces come in. So we have this stronghold right here. So this is the most advantageous place for the player to take care of the enemy. And this is paired with this hallway space right here, so which is acting as sort of the primary flank right here. So sometimes spaces like this are used together in cooperation in order to create a slightly different effect. But as you can see, most of the exits are on this side, so in order to exit out of this stronghold space, you have to go out into this clearing space. And so the clearing space encourages the player not to sort of stand out here in the open. It has some cover around the edges, but mostly this is about like the player gets out here and probably doesn't want to use it a whole lot. They get over here instead into either this alcove space right here or this this hideout here. And as you can see, the hideout is pretty shallow, so it doesn't really provide the same sort of looping mechanisms as over here. Anyway, so by breaking down spaces into sort of these model combat cells, it's easier to sort of analyze a super complex space on its on a whole. So essentially looking at how we use each of these individual spaces sort of creates this sense of almost kind of like a symphony of combat space from one to another. Anyway, so that's what I have to say about combat space for this lecture. Now I want to move on to what I call constructing a journey.